Before sunrise, the East River lies still enough to hold its own reflection, and then, slowly, it does not. A current moves beneath the surface long before any light touches it. A tidal strait, not a river in the ordinary sense, where water pushes one way with the rising sea and then reverses hour by hour, as if the earth itself could not decide which direction the crossing should take. Mist gathers low over the water in these first moments, thickest where the shorelines pull farthest apart, and through that mist, if one waited long enough in the 1860s, there would be nothing to see. No towers, no cables, no roadway suspended between two cities, only water, and the dark shapes of ferries beginning their first crossings of the day, and two skylines that had never touched. For decades afterward, once the mist had cleared and something extraordinary stood in its place, this crossing would be spoken of the way people speak of things they still do not quite believe. Quote, "It would remain for years after its completion the longest suspension bridge ever built by human hands. Its main span stretching across the water farther than any before it, farther than most engineers of its era believed such a structure could stretch without collapsing under its own reach. Its two towers would rise higher than anything else on the continent, taller than any building in the Western Hemisphere at the time, granite reaching into the sky in a way that made church spires and government domes look modest by comparison. While people would stand at the water's edge simply to look up at them, the way one might look up at a mountain that had not been there the year before. This is the story of that crossing. Brooklyn Bridge, though it would not carry that name for years, yet, not officially, not in the minds of the engineers who first sketched its towers on paper. In the 1860s, when this story begins, it did not exist even as an idea most people took seriously. It existed as a rumor of ambition, a proposal that circulated among businessmen and politicians and was met, more often than not, with polite doubt. Bridges of that era were built across rivers that behaved themselves, narrow, calm, predictable. The East River was none of these things. It was a tidal strait connecting two bodies of water, prone to fierce currents, choked with ship traffic, wide enough that no bridge on Earth had ever attempted to cross a comparable distance in a single, unsupported span. Engineers who had built bridges elsewhere, competent men with real reputations, looked at the East River and shook their heads. It could not be done. Not at that width, not over that current, not with the materials and methods available to them, and yet the story that follows is not one of spectacle, not primarily. It is easy, looking back from a century and a half later, to reach for words like triumph, like miracle, like impossible, made possible. And in time, this account will not shy from wedging what was achieved. But the truer texture of this history is quieter than that. It is a story of patience stretched across 14 years. It is a story of calculation, of men and eventually one remarkable woman working through mathematics that had never been tested at this scale, checking and rechecking assumptions about wind, about weight, about the tensile strength of steel wire, because there was no one to ask who had done this before. It is a story of endurance in the most literal sense, of bodies enduring pressure far beneath the riverbed, of a project enduring the deaths of the men who conceived it, of a structure enduring for well over a century past the point anyone expected it might need to. If there is triumph here, it arrives slowly, and it arrives at a cost, and it is best understood not as a single moment of victory, but as the accumulated weight of thousands of small, careful decisions made correctly, one after another, for many years. To understand why such a crossing mattered, enough to attempt something so uncertain, it helps to sit for a moment in the 1860s, before any of it began. On one side of the East River stood New York, already the busiest port in the nation, its docks crowded with masts, its streets thick with commerce and immigration, and the general noise of a city outgrowing itself. On the other side stood Brooklyn, at the time still its own independent city and no small one. By some counts, the third largest in the entire country, a place of its own churches and shipyards and row houses, its own newspapers, its own sense of civic pride. These were not a city and its suburb. They were two full cities, each with hundreds of thousands of residents, separated by a strait of water that froze hard enough some winters to stop ferry traffic entirely, and churned rough enough in storms to make the crossing genuinely dangerous the rest of the year. The ferries were the only way across. Dozens of them ran throughout the day, steam-powered vessels carrying workers, merchants, schoolchildren, livestock, mail. The entire daily exchange between two cities that depended on each other but could not simply walk between one another. On a calm morning, the crossing might take 12 minutes and feel almost pleasant. On a morning of fog or ice or heavy current, that same crossing could take an hour or fail to run at all, stranding thousands of commuters on one shore while their workplaces, their families, their entire daily lives waited unreachable on the other. The inconvenience was constant, but it was more than inconvenience. It was a kind of ceiling on what these two cities could become together. Goods moved slowly. People hesitated to commit to jobs or homes on the far shore. The strait, useful as it was for shipping, was also a wall. It is worth pausing on that word because it will recur quietly throughout this account. A wall of water holding two ambitious cities apart in an age that had already begun to believe that no natural obstacle should be allowed to remain permanent if enough will and enough iron could be brought against it. This was the decade of transcontinental railroads pushing across mountain ranges, once thought impassable, of telegraph cables laid along the floor of the Atlantic Ocean, of a rapidly industrializing nation that had started to measure its own progress by the size of what it dared to attempt. A bridge across the East River, if it could be built at all, would not simply solve a transportation problem. It would stand as a statement about what an era believed itself capable of. But belief and capability were not the same thing. And in the 1860s, most engineers who studied the East River seriously concluded that a suspension bridge of the required length was, at best, an extraordinary risk, and suspension bridges existed already, smaller ones, spanning gorges and modest rivers held aloft by the tension of massive cables strung between towers. But every increase in length brought a corresponding increase in the forces a bridge had to withstand. The sheer weight of the roadway itself, the sway and pull of wind across an open span, the load of everything that would eventually cross it. No one had built a suspension bridge approaching the distance the East River demanded. The mathematics existed in theory. Whether they held up in practice, at this scale, over water this difficult, was an open question that no one had yet been forced to answer with their own name attached to the result. One man believed the question could be answered. He had spent much of his career building bridges that others called impossible before he began them, and succeeding anyway through a combination of careful engineering and a willingness to trust calculations that his contemporaries found difficult to accept on faith. It was he who first proposed seriously and in detail that a suspension bridge could cross the East River, not as a hopeful sketch, but as a structure whose towers, whose cables, whose every measurement he was prepared to defend against every doubter in the profession. He would not live to see it completed. That fact alone tells part of the story of what this crossing demanded of the people who built it. But before his death, before the project even broke ground, he set down the design that would, in time, prove itself correct in nearly every particular, and he passed the work, when he could no longer carry it himself, to his son, and eventually, in circumstances no one anticipated at the outset, to his son's wife. Who would guide the bridge through its final and most difficult years with a command of engineering that the era rarely permitted a woman to publicly claim. Their names will come, along with the names of the thousands of others, the stonemasons, the wire spinners, the men who worked in compressed air far beneath the riverbed and paid for it with their health or their lives. The skeptics in the newspapers who called the whole endeavor reckless, and the officials who nearly let politics sink the project before the first stone was laid. All of it will come slowly, the way the bridge itself came together, not in a single dramatic gesture, but in 14 years of patient, exacting labor. For now, it is enough to sit with the water at dawn, mist still lifting off the current, ferries crossing where nothing yet spans the strait, and to hold in mind the simple, staggering fact that within this account, an ordinary crossing will become one of the great structures in the history of the built world. If this is the kind of story that settles you rather than startles you, you're welcome to stay a while longer. And if you'd like more chronicles like this one, the channel will be here. For now, let the mist sit on the water a little longer. The men who would change this crossing forever have not yet arrived at the shore. In the years before the bridge, Brooklyn and Manhattan stood as two separate cities in every sense that mattered, divided not merely by water, but by charter, by government, by the particular pride that each place took in being itself and nothing else. Manhattan was already the greater of the two in the world's imagination, a place of counting houses and crowded wharves, its streets thickening year upon year with the traffic of a nation that had begun to measure its own growth by how quickly that island could absorb new arrivals. Brooklyn across the strait had spent the same years becoming something remarkable in its own right, no longer a scattering of villages and farmland, but the third largest city in the country by the 1860s, a place of church spires and row houses and its own restless commerce, growing at a pace that startled even the men who lived through it. Its population had multiplied many times over in the space of a few decades, swollen by families seeking quieter streets than Manhattan could offer, while still needing to reach the island every working day of their lives. The two cities faced each other across a channel of water that was, by the standards of the world's great rivers, not especially wide. But the East River was not truly a river in the gentle sense of the word. It was a tidal strait, a channel of the sea itself, moving twice each day with currents that could run swift and treacherous, carrying with them the debris of a harbor already among the busiest on Earth, and choked in certain seasons with ice that came down from the Long Island Sound and packed itself against the shorelines until passage became a matter of chance rather than schedule. Between these two cities passed the ferries, and it was on the ferries that the whole daily life of both places came to depend. By the middle of the century, there were several ferry lines running between Brooklyn and Manhattan, their boats crossing again and again through every hour of daylight and well into the night, carrying clerks and laborers, merchants and servants, crates of goods and barrels of provisions, entire households, moving furniture from one shore to the other. The busiest of these routes, the Fulton Ferry, alone carried tens of thousands of passengers each day at the height of its operation, a volume of traffic that would have strained any system of small wooden boats crossing tidal water, did strain it, visibly and often. The crossing itself took only minutes when conditions were fair, but conditions on the East River were rarely simple. Fog rolled in from the harbor without warning and swallowed the boats whole, leaving captains to navigate by ear and instinct while other vessels, sailing ships and steamers and barges moving through one of the busiest ports in the world, passed unseen close by. Collisions were not uncommon. Passengers sometimes waited on the docks for an hour or more as boats were held back by weather, their business in the other city delayed, their wages docked, their patience worn thin by a commute that no one could ever fully trust. Worse than fog, worse than the ordinary chop of the tide, was the ice. In the coldest weeks of winter, when the strait filled with broken floes carried down from the Sound, ferry service could stop entirely, sometimes for days at a stretch. Accounts from the period describe boats trapped mid-channel, their hulls groaning against the pressure of the ice, passengers standing on deck in the cold, with no certainty of when they might reach either shore. There is a story, often repeated though not fully verifiable in every detail, of a Brooklyn doctor unable to reach a patient in Manhattan during one such ice closure, a story that circulated afterward as a kind of parable for the danger of leaving two great cities dependent on the whims of tide and weather for their only connection. Whether or not every detail of that particular account survives scrutiny, the underlying truth was widely felt and rarely disputed. A city of this size, a commerce of this scale, could not indefinitely rely on wooden boats crossing open water at the mercy of the elements. The ferries had served their purpose for generations and served it well within their limits, but those limits were becoming, by the 1860s, impossible to ignore. The economic pressure building beneath this daily inconvenience was substantial, and it was plainly understood by the merchants and civic leaders of both cities. Brooklyn's growth as a residential and manufacturing center depended on the ease with which its people could reach the commercial heart of Manhattan, and Manhattan's own commerce depended in turn on the labor and goods that crossed daily from the other shore. Every hour lost to fog, every day lost to ice, every overcrowded ferry that left passengers stranded on the dock was quietly understood as a tax on the prosperity of both places. There was also, beneath the practical argument, something more personal and more difficult to name outright. A sense among Brooklyn's citizens in particular that their city, however large it had grown, remained perpetually cast as the lesser twin of Manhattan, separated not only by water but by a kind of standing in the world's eye, that a permanent crossing might finally close that distance, in more than one sense. It was against this backdrop of daily friction and civic ambition that the idea of a bridge across the East River began to move from the realm of speculation into something resembling a formal undertaking. The notion itself was not new. Engineers and dreamers had proposed bridges and even tunnels beneath the East River for decades before any serious plan took hold, most of these proposals falling away for want of money, technology, or political will. But by the late 1860s, the pressure had grown sufficient that a serious effort could be organized, and in the year 1867, the New York State Legislature granted a charter to a private corporation called the New York Bridge Company, formed for the specific purpose of building and operating a bridge between Brooklyn and Manhattan. The company was in the fashion typical of large infrastructure projects of that era, a blend of public purpose and private ambition that would strike a modern observer as unusual, though it was entirely ordinary for its time." End quote. Its capital stock was to be subscribed partly by private investors and partly by the cities of Brooklyn and New York themselves, with Brooklyn in particular committing a substantial portion of the funding, since it stood to gain the most from finally being tied by something more permanent than a ferry schedule to the commercial engine across the water. The company's board was populated by a mixture of financiers, politicians, and civic leaders, some genuinely devoted to the public good the bridge might serve, others drawn by the opportunities for influence and profit that inevitably attend a project of such scale and such promised permanence. This mixture of motives would trail the bridge throughout its long construction, surfacing later in disputes over contracts, materials, and money, though those difficulties belonged to chapters still ahead. What mattered in these earliest years was that a legal and financial vehicle now existed to actually attempt the crossing, and attention turned quickly to the question of who might design it and how such a thing could possibly be achieved. Here the skepticism began in earnest, and it came from serious and credentialed people, not merely from the idly doubtful. The East River presented a set of engineering demands that, taken together, had no true precedent anywhere in the world at that time. Any bridge across the strait would need a single span of extraordinary length, since the volume of shipping traffic passing beneath made the placement of piers directly in the channel impossible to consider seriously. Tall-masted sailing vessels, still common in harbour traffic of the period, needed sufficient clearance beneath any structure to pass without lowering their masts, which meant the deck of any bridge would need to sit high above the water, higher than almost any roadway yet built for such a purpose. The span required to clear the main channel without central support was longer than any suspension bridge yet constructed anywhere on Earth, longer by a considerable margin than the bridges that had earned their designers' reputations in Europe and in the American West. And beneath all of this lay the simple, stubborn problem of the riverbed itself, largely unknown in its composition at the depths required, a bed of mud and sand and buried debris that no one could yet say would hold the towers such a bridge would need. Engineers who examined the proposal in these early years were divided, and many of the most respected among them expressed open doubt that a bridge of the necessary span could be built at all, let alone built safely, let alone built to carry not only foot and carriage traffic, but eventually the greater weights that a growing metropolis would demand of it. The popular press, sensing both the ambition and the uncertainty of the undertaking, treated the proposal with a mixture of fascination and open derision. The same publications, sometimes praising the vision of the project on one page and mocking its impracticality on another. It was, by any reasonable measure of the engineering knowledge available in 1867, an audacious thing even to attempt. And yet, beneath the skepticism, the stakes of the project were understood with a clarity that skepticism alone could not dislodge. Two cities, each among the largest and most consequential in the nation, needed a way to become, in practice, if not in law, a single connected place. The crossing would have to rise high enough to let the tall ships of the world's busiest harbour pass beneath it undisturbed, and it would have to be strong enough to carry, atop that same clearance, the accumulating weight of carriages and pedestrians, and in time, the machinery of a modern city moving across it every day without pause. No one in these early years could say with certainty how such a thing might be built, or even whether it truly could be, but the need for it was no longer a matter of debate. It was the fact around which every ferry delay, every fog-bound morning, every week of ice-locked winter had already argued its case long before a single engineer stepped forward to answer the question of how. The man who stepped forward to answer that question had already spent much of his life proving that impossible was a word other people used too easily. John Augustus Roebling had come to America from Prussia as a young man trained in the rigorous discipline of Prussian civil engineering, schooled in mathematics and the theory of structures at a time when such training was rare and precious. He had studied under men who believed that a bridge, like any structure, could be reduced to numbers, that the forces moving through a span could be calculated and accounted for with the same certainty as the motion of the stars. And he had carried that conviction with him across an ocean when he came to settle in the young Republic of America, country still hungry for engineers who could turn its rivers and gorges into crossable things rather than barriers. He had not begun as a bridge builder in any grand sense. His first American years were spent as a farmer and then as a manufacturer, and it was in this second calling that he found the material that would define the rest of his working life. Wire, rope, spun and twisted from individual strands of iron into a single unified cable, was in these years a new and imperfect technology used mostly for hauling canal boats and powering machinery. Roebling saw in it something more. He saw a material that might replace the iron chains then commonly used in suspension bridges, chains that were prone to catastrophic failure when a single link gave way, snapping in an instant and bringing an entire structure down. Cable made of many wires, by contrast, would not fail all at once. If a wire broke, the load would simply redistribute itself among its neighbors, and the whole would hold, wounded perhaps, but intact. It was a small insight with enormous consequences, and Roebling built a business and eventually a reputation on the strength of it. That reputation was tested and confirmed in a series of bridges that few other engineers of the era would have attempted. At Niagara, where the gorge cut deep and violent beneath the falls, he built a suspension bridge intended not merely for foot traffic, but for the full weight of a railway, a task that critics insisted was beyond the physical limits of suspension technology, that the deck would sway and buckle under the passage of a locomotive, that the whole enterprise was a vanity destined to end in the river below. Roebling answered these doubts, not with argument, but with stiffening trusses worked into the roadway itself, a system that dampened the oscillations his critics feared. And when trains began to cross the completed span in safety, the doubts that had surrounded the project quieted into something closer to awe. He built again over the Allegheny and again over the Ohio at Cincinnati, each bridge longer and more ambitious than the last, each one a further demonstration that the principles he had worked out on paper held true when tested against wind, weight, and water. By the time he turned his attention to the East River, John Roebling was no longer a man asking to be trusted. He was a man whose record had already answered that question for him several times over in structures that still stood and still carried traffic across water that had once been considered uncrossable by any means but a boat. Those who worked with him described a man of exacting and almost unforgiving precision, someone who trusted little to chance and less to sentiment. He was not, by most accounts, an easy man to know. He held strong convictions about diet and health that struck many of his contemporaries as eccentric. He read philosophy with the same rigor he brought to structural calculation, and he demanded of the men around him a standard of care that some found difficult to sustain. But this same exactness was precisely what made him the engineer that cities turned to when the stakes of failure were measured in human lives rather than inconvenience. He was known to recalculate what other engineers considered already settled, to test assumptions that others accepted as given, to build in margins of safety that seemed to less careful minds almost excessive. It was this quality, more than any single technical innovation, that made his name a kind of guarantee. When John Roebling said a bridge would stand, those who had watched him work understood that he had already imagined every plausible way it might fail and had built against each one in turn. It was this reputation that drew him toward the East River in the years following the Civil War, when the long-deferred question of a permanent crossing between Brooklyn and New York had finally gathered enough political and financial weight to demand a serious answer. Roebling did not propose a modest structure. He proposed a suspension bridge with a central span exceeding anything he or any other engineer had yet attempted, a crossing that would leap across open water on a scale that made his earlier bridges, remarkable as they were, look like preliminary sketches for the real work of his career. The towers he envisioned would rise higher than nearly any structure then standing on the American continent, taller than most church steeples, taller than the masts of the great sailing ships that would pass beneath the span on their way to and from the harbor. The cables he proposed would be thicker and stronger than any yet spun, built up from steel wire rather than the iron he had used in his earlier bridges, a material still new enough that some engineers regarded its widespread structural use with suspicion. It was, in every particular, a design that asked the river to accept something it had never been asked to bear, and it asked the two cities on either bank to trust that a single man's calculations could make such a thing not only possible, but safe. What steadied the nerves of skeptical boards and cautious investors was not merely the boldness of the design, but the calm, almost unnerving confidence with which Roebling defended it. He did not speak of the bridge in the language of ambition or grandeur. He spoke of it in the language of loads and stresses and safety factors, walking committees through his reasoning with the patience of a man who had already lived through this argument many times before, in smaller forms over other rivers. He built into his design a margin of strength that went well beyond what his own calculations suggested the bridge would need to bear, reasoning that no calculation, however careful, could fully anticipate every condition a structure might one day face: the unpredictable violence of a coming storm, the corrosive slow work of salt air over decades, the simple accumulation of a growing city's daily weight over a span of years no one could yet foresee. This obsession with excess strength, with building for the conditions no one could predict, rather than merely the conditions everyone expected, was not born of caution alone. It was the expression of a philosophy that treated a bridge as a promise extended across time, a structure whose safety could not be verified once and then forgotten, but which had to remain true under stresses its builder would never live to see tested. It is a particular irony of the story, and one that has been noted many times since, that the man who built his reputation on foreseeing every danger a structure might face did not foresee the danger that would end his own involvement in the greatest of his designs. In the early summer of 1869, while the bridge existed, still only as drawings and calculations, and the early stirrings of preparation along the waterfront, Roebling was surveying the Brooklyn side of the crossing, working to fix the precise location where the Brooklyn Tower would rise. He was standing near the edge of a ferry slip, taking measurements, when an incoming ferry boat, easing toward its landing, crushed his foot between the boat and the pilings before he could move clear. The injury itself, though severe, was not thought at the time to be beyond recovery. His toes were amputated in the days that followed, and for a time it seemed the accident would be remembered only as a painful delay in the work that lay ahead. But the wound did not heal as expected. In the weeks that followed, infection set in, and the particular strain of infection that took hold in Roebling's body was tetanus, a disease for which medicine in that era had no reliable answer. He suffered through convulsions and a slow, agonizing decline that no treatment available to his doctors could arrest. And within a matter of weeks after the accident that had seemed at first a minor misfortune, John Augustus Roebling was dead. He had not laid a single stone of the bridge. He had spent years imagining. He had not seen a single caisson sunk into the riverbed, had not watched a single length of cable spun across the water he had studied so carefully from its banks. The design existed meticulous and complete in its essentials, but the man who had proven again and again that the impossible could be reduced to careful calculation and disciplined execution would not live to see whether the East River crossing would join that record or become the exception to it. What did not die with him was the vision itself, nor the particular understanding of how that vision might be carried forward. Roebling had a son, Washington Augustus Roebling, whom he had trained from an early age in the discipline of engineering, who had studied at Rensselaer Polytechnic Institute, and who had already worked at his father's side on the Cincinnati Bridge. Learning firsthand the exacting standards and quiet obsessions that shaped his father's approach to every structure he built. It was to this son, tempered by his father's teaching and already familiar with the particular demands of suspension bridge construction, that the responsibility of the East River crossing now passed, not as an inheritance freely chosen, but as a duty that circumstance had placed squarely in his hands. The plans were his father's, the calculations, the proportions, the philosophy of excess strength, built against unknown futures. All of it bore the elder Roebling's unmistakable signature. But the task of turning those plans into stone and steel and cable, of standing at the site each day and answering for every decision as the work rose slowly out of the riverbed, now belonged to Washington Roebling alone, a young engineer about to discover that the ground beneath the East River held difficulties his father's calculations had not fully prepared him to face. Before a single stone had been set into the riverbed, the bridge had already been declared impossible by men whose opinions carried weight. Engineers of standing, men who had built their reputations on smaller spans and safer calculations, looked at the proposed length between the towers and shook their heads. A single unsupported span of 1,600 feet, stretched across open water, subject to tide and current and the battering of winter ice, exceeded anything that had been attempted anywhere in the world. The suspension bridges that had come before, admired in their own time, had been shorter, lighter, and in more than one case had failed in ways that lingered in the professional memory of every engineer old enough to remember them. There were stories still told in the drafting rooms and engineering societies of the eastern cities, of bridges that had twisted and torn themselves apart in high wind, of cables that had snapped without warning, of towers that had leaned and cracked under loads their designers had sworn they could bear. Against this backdrop of caution earned through disaster, the plan for a bridge across the East River seemed to many not ambitious, but reckless. A proposal that asked the laws of material and gravity to bend further than they ever had before. The newspapers took up the argument with the appetite they reserved for anything that might prove either triumphant or catastrophic. Some editorials treated the bridge as a symbol of American ingenuity, finally equal to its confidence, a structure that would prove the nation capable of engineering feats to rival anything built in Europe. Others were less generous. Skeptical columns questioned whether any tower could be sunk deep enough into the riverbed to hold steady against the currents that ran beneath the East River, currents strong enough to overturn small boats and drag debris for miles. Letters to the editor, written by men who signed themselves only as concerned citizens or taxpayers, warned that the project was a folly that would consume public and private money alike before collapsing, quite literally, under its own ambition. Cartoonists sketched towers leaning at impossible angles, cables snapping in mid-air, ferries continuing their crossings undisturbed while the great bridge lay in ruins beside them. It was not universal condemnation. There were those, including engineers of genuine standing, who examined John Roebling's calculations and found them sound, who pointed to his earlier bridges at Niagara and elsewhere as proof that a suspension span of unprecedented scale was not merely a hopeful gamble, but the product of a career spent solving exactly this kind of problem. Yet the skepticism was loud enough and repeated often enough that it settled into the public imagination as a kind of background hum, a doubt that traveled alongside the project through every year of its construction. The doubt was not only about the abstract question of whether a span so long could stand, it touched, more urgently for some, on money. Even before ground was broken, disagreements arose over how the state would provide the enormous private capital and municipal will such a project would demand, since a work of this scale sat awkwardly between private enterprise and public infrastructure, needing the cooperation of two separate cities, and state legislators who each had their own interests to protect. Into this uncertain space stepped men whose interest in the bridge had less to do with its engineering than with the opportunities its construction might provide. Tammany Hall, the political organization that held enormous sway over municipal contracts and appointments in the city of New York during these years, found in the bridge project a source of patronage too large to ignore. Board seats, construction contracts, and the steady flow of public funds toward material and labor represented exactly the kind of opportunity that political operators of the era knew how to exploit. William Tweed himself, whose name would later become synonymous with municipal corruption on a scale that shocked even a public accustomed to graft, held a position on the bridge's board of trustees during its early years, a fact that would later cast a long shadow over the project's finances even as the towers themselves remained only partially risen from the water. The entanglement with Tammany interests meant that questions over funding and contracts shadowed the bridge from its earliest days. Questions that had little to do with whether the design could bear its intended load, and everything to do with whether the public's money was being spent honestly. Contracts for the supply of wire, in particular, would later become a source of scandal when it was discovered that inferior material had been substituted for the wire specified in the engineering drawings, sold to the project through connections that owed more to political favor than to competitive integrity. That discovery lay some years in the future from the vantage point of the bridge's early construction, but the atmosphere that made such a substitution possible was already present in these years. An atmosphere in which the enormous scale of the project's budget attracted men more interested in what could be skimmed from it than in what could be built with it. For the engineers charged with the actual construction, this meant that every request for funds, every report to the Board of Trustees carried an additional weight beyond the purely technical. It was not enough to prove that a decision was sound engineering. It had to survive scrutiny from men whose priorities did not always align with the soundness of the structure itself. Beyond the political shadow, there remained more straightforward engineering rivalries, alternative visions for how the East River might be crossed that competed for public and official attention, even as work on the bridge inched forward. Some engineers and civic figures argued that a tunnel beneath the river rather than a bridge above it would offer a safer and more certain solution, avoiding entirely the question of whether towers could be sunk deep enough or whether a span could be built long enough to clear the shipping lanes below. Tunneling technology of the era, though still developing, had already demonstrated some success elsewhere, and proponents of this approach pointed to the absence of any need to defy gravity across open water as a decisive advantage. Others proposed shorter, lower bridges built with additional support piers driven into the riverbed at intervals, sacrificing the unobstructed channel that shipping interests demanded in exchange for a design that asked less of any single span. These proposals never gained the political or financial momentum needed to displace the Roebling design, but they persisted in public discussion for years, offered up each time the bridge project encountered delay or difficulty, as evidence that a different, perhaps more sensible approach had been available all along. Every setback at the construction site, every winter that passed without visible progress on the towers, every report of injury or death among the workers, became an occasion for these rival visions to resurface in editorial pages, a reminder to the public that the path chosen was not the only path and perhaps not the wisest one. It was against this background of technical doubt, political entanglement, and competing visions that Washington Roebling now found himself standing, no longer merely an engineer executing another man's designs, but the sole figure responsible for proving those designs correct in the eyes of a skeptical public, a suspicious press, and a board of trustees whose composition included men more interested in contracts than in cables. The burden this placed upon him extended beyond the purely technical challenges of the riverbed and the currents, though those alone would have tested any engineer of his generation. He carried also the weight of his father's reputation, a reputation built over decades of careful, successful work, now staked entirely on a project that had not yet proven itself, and that faced organized skepticism from multiple directions at once. Every decision he made in these early years, every choice about how deep the caissons should sink or how the tower should be shaped, would be read not only as an engineering judgment, but as a referendum on whether the elder Roebling's vision, and by extension his son's competence to carry it out, deserved the confidence that had been placed in it. The scale of investment involved only sharpened this pressure. The bridge, from its earliest authorization, represented a commitment of capital that dwarfed almost any civic project attempted in America to that point. A sum that would eventually stretch across more than a decade of construction and grow well beyond its original estimates. as the true difficulty of the work revealed itself season by season. Investors who had committed funds in the expectation of a reasonably timed return watched the years pass with towers still rising slowly from their foundations. No roadway yet strung across the river, no revenue yet flowing from tolls that existed only on paper. The citizens of Brooklyn and New York, whose taxes and civic pride were equally invested in the project's success, were asked to extend a patience that grew harder to sustain with each passing year of visible but incomplete progress. It was a patience that would be tested further as the true difficulties of the riverbed made themselves known, difficulties that no amount of careful calculation on paper had fully anticipated, and that would soon draw Washington Roebling himself down into conditions far more dangerous than any drafting room had prepared him to endure. Beneath the surface of the East River, where the water ran dark and cold and carried the debris of 2 growing cities on its tides, lay a bed of mud and silt that had been settling for centuries without any thought of the weight it would one day be asked to carry. This was the problem that no bridge before had ever truly faced in such demanding terms, for the East River was not a placid inland waterway, but a tidal strait, its currents reversing with the pull of the moon, its floor a shifting accumulation of sediment that gave no easy purchase to anything resting upon it. Beneath that silt, at a depth no one could state with certainty until the digging began, lay bedrock, the only foundation firm enough to bear the towers that would eventually rise hundreds of feet into the air and hold, between them a roadway suspended on wire. The towers could not simply be built upon the riverbed as it was. They had to be founded on something that would not shift, not settle unevenly, not surrender by inches over the years to the relentless work of water and current. And that something lay buried, its exact depth unknown, beneath layers of mud that had to be removed by human hands working in conditions that had rarely, if ever, been attempted at such scale in the history of construction. Solution that Washington Roebling settled upon, refined from techniques used on a smaller scale in European engineering and in the construction of the Eads Bridge across the Mississippi, was the pneumatic caisson, a term that would soon become familiar to newspaper readers in both Brooklyn, though few of them fully grasped what it meant to work inside one. A caisson, in its essence, was an enormous upside-down box built of timber reinforced with iron, with no bottom and a sealed top, designed to be sunk into the riverbed and to create, within its sealed chamber, a pocket of dry working space held open against the crushing pressure of the river by compressed air pumped in from above. The concept was almost paradoxical to those who first heard it described, a chamber pressed downward through water and mud, and yet kept dry within by the simple, invisible pressure of air forced in faster than the water could intrude. Inside that chamber, men would dig by lamplight, removing the silt and clay and buried debris of the riverbed by hand, shovel by shovel, bucket by bucket, lowering the caisson deeper as the material beneath it was cleared away, until at last, if all went as planned, the chamber would rest upon bedrock itself, and upon that chamber, filled eventually with concrete, the great stone tower would begin its slow ascent into the sky. The construction of the caissons themselves was an undertaking of such scale that shipyards were engaged to build them, for nothing so large had been built as a single sealed structure before. The Brooklyn caisson, the first to be built and sunk, measured over 160 feet in length and more than half that in width, its timber walls many feet thick, reinforced with iron plating along its edges, to withstand the grinding pressure of the riverbed as it descended. It was built on land near the Brooklyn shore and then floated out and positioned with elaborate care above the spot chosen for the tower's foundation, a process that itself required calculations of buoyancy and ballast that had never before been applied at such a scale in American engineering. Once positioned, the caisson was gradually weighted down with masonry laid upon its roof, the beginning of the tower itself rising even as the caisson beneath it sank, so that the structure above ground and the excavation below proceeded together, each dependent upon the other, in a rhythm that would continue for months. Inside the caisson, once the compressed air had been established and the chamber sealed against the river, men descended through iron shafts, fitted with airlocks, passageways that allowed workers to pass from the ordinary atmosphere above into the pressurized world below. The chamber itself was lit by gas lamps, for candles would not burn properly in the compressed air, and posed too great a risk of fire in a sealed timber space, and the light they cast was described by those who worked beneath it as a strange, flattened glow, casting long shadows across the mud walls and the timber ceiling that pressed close overhead. The air itself felt different to breathe, thick and warm, carrying the smell of wet earth and the sweat of dozens of men laboring in a confined space with little ventilation beyond what the compression system provided. The work of digging was done with picks and shovels, the material loaded into buckets that were hoisted up through the airlock shafts to be dumped above. And the pace of that work, though it might have seemed slow to an impatient observer standing on the riverbank far above, was in truth all that human bodies could sustain in such conditions. Hour after hour, day after day, the descent of the caissons was measured not in days but in seasons, for the ground beneath the river did not yield evenly, and the workers frequently encountered obstacles that no survey could have predicted, buried boulders that had to be broken apart with drills, and, in some cases, small charges of explosives set with extraordinary caution in a sealed chamber filled with compressed air, old ship timbers and debris from the river's long use as a channel of commerce, pockets of quicksand that shifted unpredictably beneath the workers' feet and threatened to swallow tools and, on occasion, nearly the men themselves. Each foot of descent was a negotiation with a riverbed that offered no guarantees, and the engineers above, receiving reports through the airlocks and through the calculations of depth and pressure that had to be constantly revised, could do little but trust the judgment of the men working below. It was work that combined the patience of an archaeologist with the physical demands of a miner, conducted in a pressurized environment whose long-term effects on the human body were, at that time, almost entirely unknown to medical science. As the New York caisson, larger still than its Brooklyn counterpart, was sunk on the opposite shore, it became necessary to descend to a depth of some 78 feet below the river's surface, into pressures that placed extraordinary strain on the men working within, and it was during this phase of the project that the true cost of the invisible labor beneath the river began to reveal itself, though the full understanding of what was happening to the workers' bodies would come only gradually and at great human expense. Subject: the record of this bridge would soon compel the world to reckon with, in ways no one had anticipated when the caissons were first designed. But it was on the Brooklyn side, where the caisson had been sunk first, and where the ground beneath the river presented its own particular uncertainties, that Washington Roebling faced a decision that would occupy the attention of engineers for generations afterward. The original intention, as with every foundation of this kind, was to sink the caisson until it rested directly upon bedrock, the only foundation considered truly reliable for a structure of such immense and permanent weight. But, as the Brooklyn caisson descended through the layers of the riverbed, the workers encountered not bedrock at the expected depth, but a stratum of sand, densely packed and remarkably firm, lying above the true bedrock, which appeared to lie considerably deeper still. Roebling was faced with a choice that no textbook of the era could resolve for him with certainty: continue the descent through this compact sand layer in pursuit of bedrock that might lie many additional feet below, prolonging the exposure of his workers to the dangers of the pressurized chamber, or accept the sand stratum itself as a foundation sufficiently firm to bear the tower's weight and seal the caisson where it stood. He chose, after careful study of the material and consultation with those he trusted most in matters of soil and load, to stop the Brooklyn caisson at a depth of just over 44 feet, resting upon that dense sand, rather than continuing toward bedrock, a decision made under the mounting pressure of worker safety cost, and the recognition that the layer beneath the caisson, tested and probed as thoroughly as the conditions allowed, appeared capable of bearing the enormous loads that would eventually rest upon it. It was a judgment call made by a man deep in the confidence of his own calculations, but one that would be debated by engineers for the rest of the bridge's life and long after. For the question of whether a foundation, resting on sand, however firm, could truly be considered equal to one resting on solid bedrock was not a question that could be answered with complete certainty in the year the decision was made. History would ultimately vindicate Roebling's judgment, for the Brooklyn Tower has stood upon that sand stratum without complaint for well over a century. But in the moment the choice was made, it carried with it all the uncertainty that attends any decision made at the edge of known engineering practice. A wager placed, not on paper, but in the compacted sand and buried silence beneath a tidal river, carped tably. There is something quietly extraordinary in the fact that the two great towers of this bridge, so celebrated in their soaring visibility, so admired by the cities that would come to see them as symbols of ambition and permanence, owe their stability to work that no citizen of Brooklyn or New York would ever see. Two, work conducted in sealed chambers far beneath the water's surface by lamplight, in air made artificial by mechanical pumps, among men whose names were rarely recorded and whose labor left no visible trace once the caissons were filled with concrete and the towers rose above them. The river closed over that history as surely as it closed over the caissons themselves, and the cities above, watching the towers climb into the sky, had little sense of the invisible foundation being negotiated foot by foot in the darkness below, a negotiation between human will and the ancient indifferent patience of a riverbed that had been settling, undisturbed for far longer than either city had existed. Down inside the chamber, the air itself was a kind of labor. It pressed against the skin and the eardrums with a weight that had no equivalent on the surface, a density that made every breath feel deliberate, as though the lungs had to be persuaded rather than simply allowed to work. Men descended through the airlock in small groups, gathered in the darkness of the shaft, and waited as the pressure built around them, a slow tightening that some described later as a hand closing gently over the whole body. Then the inner door would open, and they would step down into the working chamber itself, into heat that seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere, radiating up from the compressed air and the packed earth and the small lamps that burned along the timber ceiling, throwing a dim, flickering light over the mud and the tools and the bent backs of the men already at work. The sound down there was constant and layered, never quite silent even in the pauses between labor. There was the hiss of the air itself, moving through valves and pipes with a steady mechanical breath of its own. There was the ring of picks against stone, the softer suck and scrape of shovels through waterlogged clay, the muffled thud of debris being loaded into buckets that would be hoisted up through the airlock to the surface. Men shouted to one another across short distances, their voices oddly flattened by the pressure, carrying less than they should have, so that communication became a matter of gesture as much as speech. The lamplight caught the sweat on their faces, and the pale color the compressed air seemed to lend to everything, a strange, bleached quality that made the chamber feel less like a place men had built and more like a place they had simply been allowed to enter for a while. The heat was worst near the bottom, where the work of clearing obstructions from the riverbed went on hour after hour. Boulders had to be broken apart or dragged aside. Ancient timber, the remains of old wrecks and forgotten pilings, had to be sawn through by hand in conditions that made the simplest task exhausting. Men worked in shifts, descending for a few hours at a time before climbing back up through the lock to rest, though rest itself was a complicated word for what followed. The body did not simply return to normal once a man stepped back into the open air. It carried the chamber with it in ways no one yet understood, and it was this, the invisible residue of the depths, that would prove in time to be the caisson's cruelest cost. At first, the affliction seemed random, almost superstitious in its selection of victim. A man would climb up from a shift, walk a short distance from the shaft, and suddenly find his knee buckling beneath him, or a strange deep ache settling into his shoulder or his hip, an ache unlike any ordinary soreness of labor. Others described a creeping numbness or a sharp pain that moved through the joints as though something inside the body had shifted and lodged where it should not be. In milder cases, the discomfort passed within a day, leaving only a lingering stiffness. In others, it did not pass at all. Men collapsed on the street, outside the works, unable to stand. Some were carried home paralyzed in one or both legs, their condition worsening rather than improving in the days that followed. A few died quietly, in circumstances no one at the time could adequately explain. The physicians of the day gave it a name born half of guesswork and half of resignation: caisson disease. And they debated its cause without resolution. Some believed it was a matter of poor circulation brought on by the pressure. Others suspected the chill of the river water, or the diet of the men, or simple exhaustion. It would be years and other projects on other rivers in other cities before the truth was understood with any clarity that the compressed air forced gas into the blood and the tissues of the body, and that the danger lay not in the descent but in the return, 20 in, the speed with which a man was allowed to rise back toward the ordinary pressure of the surface. Rise too quickly, and the gas that had dissolved quietly into the body under pressure would begin to form again as it had been before, tiny and sudden, lodging in joints and nerves and, in the worst cases, in the vessels feeding the heart or the brain. But this understanding came too late for the men who worked the caissons of the Brooklyn Bridge, and even once a rough pattern was noticed, that slower ascent seemed to help, that certain men seemed more vulnerable than others. There was no science yet sturdy enough to prevent what the record shows plainly: dozens of men afflicted, some permanently. Some fatally over the years, the caissons were sunk on both sides of the river. Washington Roebling did not spare himself from the descents. As chief engineer, he insisted on inspecting the work personally, going down into the chamber on the New York side again and again through the long months of excavation, watching the progress of the digging with his own eyes, satisfying himself of the soundness of each decision before it was made. He believed, as many engineers of his generation believed, that leadership meant presence, that a man could not properly direct work he had not seen and felt for himself. It was a conviction that served the project well in its early stages and cost him dearly in the end. The exact date is a matter of some dispute among those who have studied his life, but the accounts agree on the shape of what happened. After one of his descents into the New York caisson, Roebling emerged with the same creeping pain that had struck so many of the sandhogs beneath him, and this time it did not pass. Over the following weeks it settled into his joints and did not release its hold. He lost strength in his legs. He suffered violent seizures of pain that left him unable to work for days at a stretch. In time, he became largely unable to leave his home, a condition that would persist, in one form or another, for the remainder of the bridge's long construction. The man who had trained his whole life to build this crossing, who had studied under his father and traveled abroad to learn the newest methods of underwater construction, who had assumed command of the project after a harbor accident had taken his father's life before the work even properly began, now found himself confined to a room in Brooklyn Heights, able to see the rising towers of his bridge only through a telescope pointed toward the window. It is worth pausing here, in the quiet space the record allows, to consider what was actually paid beneath that river by men whose names have not all survived the century and a half since. The company's own accounting, incomplete as it is, suggests that more than 100 men suffered some degree of caisson sickness during the excavation work on both towers, and that a number of these, the sources disagree on the precise figure, and no ledger was kept with the completeness later generations would wish for, or did not survive. At all, some names appear in the surviving payroll records, brief and unadorned. A laborer paid so many dollars for a week's work, nothing more. Others appear only in the fact of their absence, a line quietly removed from the following week's list. The engineers who oversaw the work, including Roebling himself, were not indifferent to this cost. Contemporary accounts describe genuine efforts to shorten shifts and adjust the pace of decompression as the pattern of illness became clearer, efforts that reduced but never eliminated the danger. It remains one of the honest, unresolved sorrows of the bridge's history that the men who built its foundations paid a price that was neither fully recorded nor fully repaid, and that the towers rising serenely above the river carried in their footings a debt owed to labor the city above scarcely paused to consider. It was in the aftermath of Roebling's illness that a new figure began to move quietly into the story of the bridge, one whose name would not appear on the official documents of the Brooklyn Bridge Company, but whose presence would prove, in time, indispensable to its completion. Emily Warren Roebling, his wife, had already shown herself to possess a sharp and disciplined mind, and in the months following her husband's collapse, she began carrying his instructions from their home to the site, relaying his calculations and decisions to the assistant engineers who could no longer consult him directly in person. What began as a practical arrangement, born of necessity rather than ambition, deepened over time into something more. She began to study the mathematics of stress and strain, the properties of the materials being used, the principles of cable construction and masonry, sitting with her husband for long hours as he explained from his sickbed, the reasoning behind each decision that still needed to be made. She was, by the accounts of those who worked alongside her in the years that followed, not merely a messenger, but an increasingly capable engineer in her own right, one who would come to carry a share of responsibility for the bridge that no title of the era was prepared to acknowledge, but which the finished structure itself would quietly confirm. She began, in those first months, with the language itself, learning the vocabulary of a profession that had never before admitted a woman past its threshold, except as a visitor. Catenary curves, modulus of elasticity, the behavior of wrought iron under tension, the precise difference between the working strength of a cable and its ultimate breaking strength, the safety factor that separated a bridge that would stand from one that would not. These were not abstractions to be nodded through. Washington Roebling required that she understand them fully, not because he doubted her intelligence, but because the men waiting at the site would ask questions that demanded real answers, and a wrong word passed along carelessly could cost lives or dollars. So she studied as an engineering student studies, with textbooks spread across the table in the house on Columbia Heights, with her husband's notes in the margins, with long mornings spent working through the mathematics of stress until the figures stopped looking like a foreign alphabet. The routine that emerged between them settled into a shape that outsiders found difficult to categorize because it matched nothing they had seen before. Washington Roebling, confined by the illness that had followed him out of the caisson and never fully released its hold, spent his days in a room with a clear view of the bridge towers rising across the water, watching the work through a telescope when his strength allowed it, and relying on Emily's eyes and ears when it did not. She would leave the house in the morning with a satchel of papers and travel to the site herself, crossing between the Brooklyn and New York approaches, climbing where the work required climbing, standing at the foot of the towers among men who had long since stopped remarking on her presence because it had become simply a fact of the project. As ordinary as the derricks or the cable reels. She spoke with the contractors, reviewed the day's progress against the plans, asked the questions her husband had prepared for her, and carried back the answers, along with her own observations, which increasingly carried the weight of independent judgment rather than mere transcription. The trust she earned on site was not given lightly, and it was not given quickly. The men who worked the towers and later the cables were, for the most part, practical people, unimpressed by titles and unwilling to follow instructions they did not respect, whatever the source. In the early months, there must have been some measure of doubt, unspoken but present, about a woman arriving with her husband's authority, but not his name on the payroll ledger, not his decades of engineering practice, not his presence beside them in the caisson. That doubt did not survive long against the evidence of her competence. She answered technical questions correctly. She caught errors in materials before they were built into the structure. She understood, when contractors proposed shortcuts or substitutions, exactly what those changes would mean for the strength of the finished span, and she said so plainly. Over the seasons that followed, the workers and the assistant engineers came to treat her not as a courier carrying instructions from a sick room, but as the person whose judgment, on any given day, most closely represented the true state of the project. He had become in practice, though never in the official records of the bridge company, something very close to the chief engineer of the works, the person to whom questions were brought and from whom decisions, in her husband's name but increasingly in her own understanding. There is a quiet unusualness to this that deserves to be sat with rather than rushed past, because the era in which it happened held no formal place for a woman in engineering at all. The universities that trained engineers did not admit women as students. The professional societies that certified and gathered engineers did not admit women as members. The language of the profession itself, in its textbooks and its journals, assumed without argument that the reader addressed was a man. Emily Warren Roebling stepped into this world not through any door built for her, because no such door existed, but through the narrow and improbable opening created by her husband's illness and her own willingness to learn what the moment demanded. She did not set out to make a statement about what women could do in a field that excluded them. The surviving record suggests she thought of herself simply as doing what needed to be done, for her husband and for the bridge, without particular ceremony about the fact that she was doing it. And yet the doing of it, sustained across years rather than months, quietly demonstrated something that no formal argument could have demonstrated as well, that the capacity to reason through stress calculations and material strength and the discipline of great construction had never actually depended on the sex of the person reasoning. Whatever the institutions of the age had assumed, the bridge did not know or care who understood it. It only needed to be understood correctly, and she came to understand it correctly. The correspondence and daily rhythm that bound the two of them together across those years took on its own particular character, shaped by distance, measured in a few miles of water and streets rather than any great geographic separation, but functioning in the demands it placed on patience and precision, almost as if the distance were far greater. Washington Roebling would prepare his instructions and observations in the mornings, when his strength was at its best, working through what needed to be conveyed to the contractors that day, what adjustments the drawings required, what questions needed answers from the men actually handling stone and wire. Emily would receive these instructions, sometimes in writing, sometimes spoken and carried in memory and notes, and would set out for the bridge to deliver them, and to gather in return the information her husband needed to continue directing work he could see only from a window. In the evenings, the exchange would run the other way. Her account of the day's progress, the difficulties encountered, the state of a particular strand of cable or a particular course of masonry, relayed back to him for his assessment and his response. It was, in its structure, not unlike the correspondence between a distant commanding officer and a trusted field deputy, except that the two people involved were husband and wife, and the field in question was one of the largest engineering works then underway anywhere in the world. He watched, when he could, through his telescope, tracking the visible progress of the towers and later the cables from the window that had become, in effect, his only remaining vantage point on the profession he had spent his life practicing. It's worth pausing on the particular quality of that watching a man who had once climbed inside the pressurized dark of the caissons himself, who had once moved through every part of the physical work with his own hands and body, now reduced to observing the same work unfold at a remove through glass, dependent entirely on the eyes and judgment of another person to know what was truly happening at ground level. There is no record of bitterness in how he approached this arrangement, at least none that survives in a form historians have judged reliable. What survives instead is evidence of confidence, a steady trust that what Emily reported to him was accurate, that what she decided in his name reflected sound engineering reasoning. On the hands she had extended into it, as safe as it would have been in his own. The project continued through these years with a steadiness that belied the unusual arrangement supporting it. Contracts were let, materials were tested and accepted or rejected, disputes with suppliers and contractors were negotiated and resolved, all of it moving forward on a rhythm that gave no outward sign that the bridge's chief engineer had not set foot on the site in years. This continuation was not automatic or effortless. It was sustained daily by the partnership between the man who held the design in his mind and the woman who carried it, piece by piece, into the physical world he could no longer enter himself. The trustees and officials of the bridge company, for their part, appear to have understood the practical reality of the arrangement, even as the formal titles remained unchanged. And there is evidence that some among them came, over time, to rely on Emily's presence and judgment as thoroughly as the workers at the towers did, corresponding with her directly on matters that would ordinarily have gone to the chief engineer himself. What emerges from this period, when the record is read plainly and without embellishment, is the picture of a project that did not falter for the absence of its designer from the physical site, because the gap between the mind that conceived the bridge and the hands and decisions that built it had been bridged by a woman who had taught herself an entire engineering discipline in order to keep faith with her husband's work. The towers continued to rise. The plans continued to be executed with the same rigor they would have received under direct supervision. And the arrangement that made this possible, extraordinary by the standards of its era, though treated at the time with remarkably little public comment, would in time come to be recognized as one of the quieter but more essential facts in the whole long history of how this particular bridge came to stand. With the towers now the responsibility of hands and eyes that answered, in the end, to Emily Roebling's careful transmission of her husband's instructions. The work of raising them continued in the manner it had begun, which was to say slowly, and with an attention to material that bordered on reverence. The choice of stone had been settled early, before either tower had risen more than a few courses above the river, and it was a choice that reflected both the practical demands of the structure and the aesthetic ambitions that John Roebling had carried with him from the start. The towers would be built primarily of limestone and granite, with Rosendale cement binding the great blocks together in a mortar that had already proven itself in decades of American construction. The limestone came from quarries in Essex County, New York, hauled south by barge and rail to the riverside yards where it would be cut and dressed before being lifted into place. The granite, harder and more resistant to the slow erosion of weather and time, was reserved for the lower courses and the areas of greatest stress, where the towers met the riverbed and where the eventual weight of cables, roadway, and all the traffic the bridge would ever carry would bear down most heavily. Some of this granite traveled a considerable distance to reach the site, quarried from sources in Maine and transported by ship along the coast before being unloaded onto the docks that had grown up around the construction. Docks that were themselves temporary structures, built solely to serve the needs of a project whose scale had already begun to reshape the waterfront on both sides of the river. The logistics of this movement were, in their own way, as demanding as any other aspect of the work. Each block of stone had to be quarried to specification, cut to dimensions that would allow it to fit precisely into the growing courses of the towers, and then moved without damage across considerable distances, first by whatever combination of rail and water transport was available, and then by the cranes and hoists that had been erected at the tower sites themselves. A single block might weigh several tons, and the operation of lifting such weights to heights that grew steadily throughout the 7 years of tower construction required equipment that was, for its time, at the edge of what mechanical engineering could reliably provide. Steam-powered derricks did much of the heavy lifting, their booms swinging blocks of limestone and granite up from barges moored at the base of each tower, through the scaffolding that wrapped the rising structure, and into the hands of the masons waiting at the working height. The derricks themselves had to be repositioned as the towers grew raised in stages, so that they always operated near the current top course, a process that added its own delays and its own dangers to a project already accustomed to both. The masons who received these blocks and set them into place were tradesmen of considerable skill, many of them experienced in the construction of large civic and religious buildings, for the towers demanded a level of precision that ordinary masonry work rarely required. The design called for neo-Gothic arches, twin openings in each tower through which the roadway would eventually pass, and the construction of these arches was among the most demanding work the masons faced. Unlike the simpler load-bearing walls of the lower tower sections, the arches required each stone to be cut at a precise angle so that the combined pressure of the surrounding blocks would hold the arch in compression, transferring weight outward and downward through the voussoirs to the solid stone below. This was an old technique, understood by masons for centuries, but the scale of these particular arches, rising far above the height of any ordinary building of the era, demanded a corresponding scale of precision in the cutting and setting of every stone. A single course, misaligned by even a small fraction, could compromise the geometry of the entire arch, and so each block was checked and rechecked before being permanently set, the masons working with plumb lines and levels to ensure that what they built would hold not only the weight already upon it. The arches themselves, once complete, gave the towers a silhouette that would in time become recognized around the world. Though at the time of their construction, they were simply the visible evidence of an engineering choice, a way of admitting the roadway through the mass of the tower without weakening its structural integrity. The pointed form of the arches, borrowed from a style of architecture that had originated centuries earlier in the cathedrals of Europe, lent the towers an appearance that some observers found unexpectedly beautiful for a work of pure engineering, a structure built not for worship or civic display, but for the passage of trains, carriages, and pedestrians across a river that had long resisted such crossing. Whether this beauty was intentional or incidental to the demands of the design was a question that occupied commentators of the period, though the towers themselves offered no answer beyond their steady, patient rise. That rise was visible for a considerable distance in every direction, and it was this visibility, more than any published account or newspaper illustration, that first brought the scale of the project into the daily awareness of the people who lived in its shadow, long before the bridge itself existed, as anything more than two unconnected towers rising from opposite banks of the river. Those towers had already become landmarks, visible above the rooftops of Brooklyn and Manhattan, taller than nearly every other structure in either city, taller than the church steeples that had previously dominated the skyline, taller than the warehouses and factories that lined the waterfront. Sailors approaching the harbor could see the towers from miles out at sea, long before they could make out any other feature of the cities they were entering. Residents of neighborhoods well removed from the immediate construction site found that the towers had become part of their daily view, glimpsed from windows and rooftops, a constant reminder of the work proceeding at the river's edge, even for those who never visited the site itself. This visibility carried its own significance, for it meant that the towers, incomplete and lacking any cable or roadway to justify their existence, had already achieved a kind of monumental status in the public imagination. They were, in effect, a landmark before the bridge itself existed, an accomplishment that stood on its own even as it represented only the first phase of a much longer undertaking. The construction of the towers did not proceed at a constant pace throughout the year, for the demands of masonry work, like so much else in the project, were subject to the rhythms of weather and season that no amount of engineering ambition could override. Winter brought conditions that made careful stonework difficult and often impossible, for cold temperatures affected the setting of mortar, ice made the scaffolding treacherous, and the shortened daylight hours reduced the number of productive working hours available to the masons and their crews. Storms, particularly the strong winds that swept across the open river during the colder months, posed additional hazards to men working at heights that grew more dangerous with each passing season. For a worker exposed on scaffolding hundreds of feet above the water had little protection against sudden gusts. As a result, construction on the towers slowed considerably during the winter months, and in some years halted almost entirely, the masons and laborers dispersing to other work or simply waiting through the cold months for conditions to improve. Each spring brought a resumption of the same careful, patient labor that had characterized the work before winter's interruption. The scaffolding was inspected and repaired where necessary, the derricks checked and readied, and the supply chains that brought stone from Essex County and Maine reactivated after months of reduced activity. The masons returned to their positions at the working height of the towers, picking up the courses of stone precisely where they had left off, matching new work to old, with the same attention to alignment and precision that had governed every stone laid before the winter halt. The seasonal rhythm halted and resumed, repeated itself across the entire span of years required to bring the towers to their full height, giving the construction a cyclical quality that mirrored the patience required of everyone involved in the project. From the engineers overseeing the work, to the iron workers and masons who spent their working lives suspended between the river and the sky, the towers required 7 years to reach the height specified in the original design, a period that encompassed multiple cycles of seasonal work and interruption, multiple winters of halted construction, and multiple springs of renewed labor. This was a slow ascent by any measure, one counted not in the days or weeks that might mark the completion of an ordinary building project, but in the individual courses of stone laid one atop another, each course representing weeks of careful work. Each foot of additional height achieved only through the patient accumulation of block upon block, arch upon arch, season upon season. The towers that eventually stood complete, their neo-Gothic arches open to the sky and their granite and limestone faces catching the light of morning and evening alike, represented not a single triumphant act of construction, but rather the sum of thousands of individual acts of precision and patience. Each stone set exactly where the design required it to be set, each course checked against the ones before it, each season's work building faithfully upon the foundation laid in seasons past. It was this accumulated patience, more than any single moment of dramatic achievement, that had brought the towers to their full height, and it was this same patience that would be required for the work that remained, the spinning of cable and the raising of roadway that would in time connect these two solitary and monumental structures into the single unified span that the world had been promised from the beginning. By the time the towers stood complete, their granite crowns catching the early light over the river, The question of what would carry the roadway between them had already been settled, though not without a long and searching argument that had occupied engineers, ironmasters, and steelmen for years before the first strand was ever drawn taut. John Roebling had specified steel wire for the 4 great cables that would bear the weight of the span, and this choice, seemingly technical, had in fact been a quiet act of faith in a material that had not yet earned the trust that iron had accumulated over a century of bridge building. Iron was known. Iron had a long and honorable record in suspension bridges across Europe and America, and there were engineers of real standing who believed that to gamble the crossing of so wide and so trafficked a river on steel, a material still young in its industrial refinement. Steel, they argued, was inconsistent in its manufacture, prone to hidden flaws that no inspection could catch, its behavior under sustained load not yet fully understood by the men who would have to answer for it if the cables ever failed. But Roebling, and after his death his son Washington, held firmly to the conviction that steel wire, properly drawn and properly tested, possessed a tensile strength that iron could never match. Strength that would translate directly into a wider margin of safety for a structure that was already being asked to span a distance no suspension bridge had ever spanned before. The decision once made committed the entire project to a material whose behavior would only be fully understood after the cables were spun and the load applied. And this uncertainty sat quietly beneath every calculation that followed, an act of engineering courage disguised as a simple specification on a drawing. The manufacture of the wire itself became, in the years that followed, a story of both technical achievement and human dishonesty, and it is worth pausing on this chapter, not because it reflects glory on the bridge, but because it reflects with unusual clarity how close even the most carefully engineered structures can come to compromise through the ordinary failures of commerce and trust. The contract for supplying the wire was awarded after competitive bidding to a manufacturer named J. Lloyd Hay, a name that would come to occupy an uneasy place in the bridge's history. The wire itself was to be code-drawn steel, galvanized against corrosion, tested rigorously for tensile strength before it was accepted into the cable spinning process. Each coil examined and certified before being released for use. For a time, the arrangement proceeded as expected, wire arriving at the site in the quantities and qualities the specifications demanded. But it was discovered, through the careful vigilance of the engineers overseeing the testing process, that Hay had been substituting inferior wire into the shipments after the certified samples had already passed inspection, sending wire that had not been tested at all into the strands being spun across the river. A deception motivated by the simple economics of selling rejected material rather than absorbing its cost. The discovery came slowly through irregularities noticed by sharp-eyed inspectors rather than through any dramatic failure at the site itself, and, when it was confirmed, it presented Washington Roebling and his engineering staff with a genuine crisis. For, by the time the fraud was uncovered, a significant quantity of the compromised wire had already been woven into the cables themselves, embedded permanently into strands that could not be practically unwound and replaced without undoing months of exacting labor. The response to this discovery reveals something of the character of the engineering conducted on this bridge. For, rather than concealing the problem or accepting the compromised material as an unavoidable loss, Roebling ordered a recalculation of the cable's capacity, determining how much additional wire, of certified and tested quality, would need to be added to the design to compensate for the strength lost to the fraudulent shipments already in place. It was by the accounts that survive an uncomfortable and costly correction, made worse by the public embarrassment of admitting that a contractor had deceived the project for a period of months before being caught. But it was a correction made with the same patience and rigor that had characterized every other decision on the bridge. and an insistence that the final structure meet its intended margin of safety, regardless of what dishonesty had been introduced along the way. Hayes' fraud, once exposed, ended his involvement with the project, though the deception itself became a quiet, recurring point of anxiety for Washington Roebling in the years that followed, a reminder that the integrity of a structure depended not only on mathematics and material science. A chain of trust stretching from the mills that drew the wire to the men who spun it across the river, any single link of which, if broken, could compromise the whole. The method by which the cables were actually formed across the river was called cable spinning, and it was a process that combined mechanical ingenuity with a patience that mirrored the slow rise of the towers themselves. Rather than manufacturing the cables in sections and hoisting them into place, the engineers employed a traveling wheel, grooved pulley, that carried a loop of wire back and forth across the river, anchored on each shore, moving along a temporary footbridge strung between the towers for the workers who tended it. Each pass of the wheel laid down 2 lengths of wire, one going and one returning, and this process was repeated again and again, thousands upon thousands of times, until enough individual wires had accumulated to form a single strand, and enough strands had accumulated, bundled and compacted together, to form one of the 4 great cables that would ultimately carry the roadway. The scale of repetition involved in this work is difficult to hold in the mind even now. Each cable, when finished, would contain thousands of individual wires, wound not loosely but compacted. The carefully controlled tension into a dense cylindrical mass, wrapped finely in a protective wrapping of additional wire to bind the strands into a single coherent unit capable of behaving under load as one continuous structural member rather than a bundle of separate threads. The work of spinning was slow by necessity, for the tension in each wire had to be carefully controlled and verified before it was accepted into the strand, since a wire drawn too tightly or too loosely relative to its neighbors would not share the load evenly, concentrating stress in ways that could weaken the cable's overall performance long before any visible sign of distress appeared. This was, in every sense, mathematics made physical, for the behavior of a suspension cable under load follows a curve known to engineers as a catenary, the same graceful curve traced by a chain or rope hung freely between 2 points. Its shape governed entirely by the distribution of weight along its length, and the tension required at every point to hold that weight in equilibrium. John Roebling had worked through these calculations years before construction began, filling notebooks with the mathematics of tension and load that would determine with exacting precision the sag of the cable at every point along its span, the angle at which it would meet the towers, the distribution of stress that the anchorages on either shore would need to resist. These were not calculations that admitted much room for improvisation once the spinning began, for the entire geometry of the bridge, the height of the towers, the depth of the anchorages, the eventual profile of the roadway itself had been derived from the same underlying curve, so that the cable spinning crews were not simply accumulating wire, but were, wire by wire, physically constructing a mathematical object that had first existed only on paper years earlier, in the careful hand of an engineer who would not live to see it built. There is something quietly humbling in this fact, that the strands being drawn back and forth across the river by the traveling wheel, day after day, in a process that from a distance must have looked almost meditative in its repetition, were following a path calculated years before by a man who had died from an injury sustained before construction even began, his mathematics outliving him to guide hands he would never see and shape a structure he would never walk across. The workers who tended the wheel and the engineers who verified the tension in each pass were engaged in a kind of collaboration across time, executing with physical patience what had been conceived with mathematical patience. Each strand a small act of faith that the calculations held, that the curve traced in the notebooks decades earlier, when fully realized in steel, bear the weight it had been designed to bear. By the time the last strand had been drawn and the final wrapping wound tight around each of the 4 cables, binding the accumulated thousands of individual wires into 4 unified structural members reaching from anchorage to tower to anchorage across the width of the river, something remarkable had been accomplished that was easy to overlook, precisely because it had happened so slowly and so repetitively, that no single day of the work could be pointed to as the moment of its achievement. Individual wires, each one modest in its own strength, capable on its own of bearing only a fraction of the load that would eventually pass over the finished bridge, had been gathered together, compacted, and bound into cables of such collective strength that they would, in time, hold aloft not only the weight of a roadway, the trade, and the daily crossing of an entire city's ambitions. It was a marvel achieved, not through any single stroke of engineering brilliance, but through the patient accumulation of thousands of correct decisions, each wire tested, each strand tensioned, each pass of the wheel verified against the mathematics that governed the whole, until slowly, wire by wire, the sky above the river had been given something to hold. And the 2 towers that had stood for so long as solitary monuments now had stretched between them the first true suggestion of the bridge that was to come. High above that river, where the wind moved without the interruption of buildings or trees, men walked and worked on wires no wider than a finger, trusting a system of ropes and pulleys and their own practiced balance to keep them from the water below. They were called wire spinners, though the word did little to convey the nature of what they did each day. Their task was to carry the loops of steel wire across the span back and forth, from anchorage to anchorage, beating the traveling wheels that would in time gather thousands of individual strands into the 4 great cables. The wheels themselves ran along a temporary track strung between the towers, and the wire unspooled behind them in long singing lines that caught the light when the sun was low over the water. To watch from the shore, witnesses said, was to see men walking on threads, moving with a calm that seemed almost indifferent to the height, though those who worked beside them knew that the calm was hard-won, built from repetition and from a discipline that left little room for hesitation. The footbridges strung ahead of the cables were themselves a kind of marvel, though a modest one, built quickly and meant to be temporary. They consisted of little more than a few planks laid across suspended ropes, swaying with the wind and with the weight of each man who crossed them, offering handrails that were, in the earliest months, hardly more than a suggestion of safety. To walk them required a particular skill, one that could not be taught in the ordinary sense, but had to be learned by the body itself through the accumulation of hours spent finding the rhythm of the sway and answering it with small adjustments of balance rather than large panicked corrections. Men who had worked on ships often took to it, well, having already learned somewhere in their limbs how to move with a surface that would not hold still. Others learned more slowly, and a few, the record suggests, never quite learned at all and left the work after a week or 2, unable to make peace with the height. The wages paid for this labor were modest by the standards later observers would apply, though they were not ungenerous for the era. A wire spinner might earn in the range of $2 to $3 for a day's work, depending on his role and his seniority, at a time when many laboring trades paid considerably less. It was, in a sense, hazard pay, though no one called it that outright, and the men who took the work understood without needing to be told that the wages reflected the risk as much as the skill. The days were long, beginning early and ending only when the light failed, for the work depended on visibility and could not easily continue after dark. In winter, when the day shortened, the crews worked fewer hours, but under harder conditions, the cold making the wire brittle and the hands that gripped it stiff and slow. In summer, the heat radiating from the exposed steel of the towers made the upper platforms nearly unbearable at midday, and the men learned to pace their labor around the sun much as farmers might, working hardest in the cooler hours and resting where they could when the heat was at its worst. Meals were taken where the work allowed, often on small platforms near the towers, sometimes on the footbridges themselves, if a man did not wish to make the long climb down and back for a short break. The food was simple bread, cold meat, sometimes a flask of coffee, or something stronger passed quietly among friends, though drink on the job was generally discouraged, and when discovered, could mean dismissal, given the stakes of even a small lapse in balance or judgment. Accounts from the period, drawn from newspaper interviews and later recollections, describe men eating in small groups, their legs hanging over open air, with the practiced unconcern of those who had simply stopped noticing the drop, at least on the surface, whatever quieter unease they carried within. There are accounts, too, of singing, work songs that helped coordinate the rhythm of hauling or served simply to pass the hours, voices carrying oddly in the open air, above the river, heard sometimes by people on the shore who could not always make out the words but recognized the cadence of men working together. Whether these songs were common or occasional, the surviving record does not entirely resolve, but enough witnesses mentioned them that the detail seems to belong honestly to the texture of those years. Camaraderie among the crews was by most accounts strong, forged by the shared understanding that each man's safety depended in some measure on the competence and care of the others. New workers were watched carefully by the veterans, corrected quietly when they made an error in handling the wire or in placing their feet, and gradually accepted into the informal hierarchy that governed the work far more than any official chain of command. There are recorded moments of small kindness. A veteran worker walking beside a nervous newcomer on his first crossing of the footbridge, talking to him steadily to keep his mind from the water below, or older hands quietly taking on the more exposed positions themselves rather than assigning them to younger or newer men. Fear was present, and the record does not pretend otherwise. Several workers later spoke of moments when the wind rose suddenly and the footbridge swayed more violently than usual, and of the particular silence that fell over a crew in those moments, all chatter stopping until the gust had passed and the platform steadied again. The dangers of the work were not merely theoretical, and the years of cable spinning, like the years of caisson work before them, exacted their toll in human life. The historical record of the deaths during the bridge's construction as a whole is not fully settled, and estimates offered by historians in the years since have ranged from as few as 20 to as many as 30 or more, depending on which incidents are counted and how injuries that led to death sometime after an accident are classified. Falls from the towers, from the footbridges, and from the unfinished structure elsewhere on the project accounted for some of these deaths, though by no means all, since the underwater work in the caissons and various accidents involving derricks, cables under tension, and falling materials also claimed lives across the long years of the project. What can be said with confidence is that the men who died were for the most part ordinary laborers whose names appeared briefly in newspaper columns and then faded from public memory, though they were remembered in the smaller and more durable way that workers often remember their own, by the crews who continued the work after them. There is no evidence of any single catastrophic collapse during the cable spinning itself, no sudden failure that claimed many lives at once. The deaths came instead in the manner such deaths so often do in this kind of labor, singly spread across months and years, each one a private tragedy folded quietly into the larger, continuing effort. The bridge's builders did not memorialize these losses with any grand gesture at the time, and the historical record treats them with a similar restraint, offering names where they survive and silence where they do not. And it seems right to honor them in the same manner here, simply as men whose labor and whose deaths were part of what the bridge finally cost. The work of spinning the cables continued through this mixture of skill, risk, routine, and quiet loss for more than a year, the wheels making their thousands of crossings, the strands accumulating one upon another, according to a plan that had been calculated long before the first wire ever left the anchorage. Each cable, when finished, would contain thousands of individual wires, bound together not by welding or any single mechanical fastening, but by the careful, uniform tension applied to every strand, and by the wrapping. The engineers charged with overseeing this process, working from the specifications Roebling had laid out and adjusted where circumstances required, checked and rechecked the tension and alignment of the strands as the work proceeded, aware that any inconsistency, however small, could weaken the cable's ability to bear its share of the roadway's future weight. It was exacting labor, layered atop dangerous labor, a combination that asked a great deal of the men involved and received, by most accounts, a level of care and steadiness that matched what was asked of them. When at last the fourth and final of the great cables was completed, drawn taut between its anchorages, and joined to its companions in the pattern that would define the bridge's silhouette for generations to come, there was no grand ceremony to mark the occasion. No crowd gathered on the shore to cheer. The completion came, instead, as a quiet milestone, recognized chiefly by the men who had done the work and by the engineers who had watched over it, a moment of relief rather than celebration. The relief of having crossed a threshold that had claimed so much labor and so much risk without giving way to catastrophe. The wire spinners who had warped the footbridges for more than a year packed away their tools, and many moved on to other trades or other projects, carrying with them whatever private memory each held of those months above the river, the particular sound of wind through taut steel, the sway of the planks beneath their feet, the songs sung on quiet mornings. The friends who had not lived to see the cables finished, what remained above the East River, stretched now in their full and finished form, were the four cables that would soon carry, in turn, the ironwork of the roadway itself, the true skeleton on which the bridge's promised crossing would finally be laid. The work that followed was of a different character entirely from what had come before. Where the spinning of the cables had asked for nerve and balance suspended in open air with little beneath the men, but the river far below, the raising of the roadway asked instead for patience of another kind. The patient assembly of thousands of separate pieces of iron and steel into a single continuous structure, each piece measured, hoisted, fitted, and bolted into place according to a design that had been years in the drafting. The cables themselves, now finished and wrapped in their protective sheathing of wire, hung in their long and gentle curves between the towers and the anchorages, waiting to receive the weight that had always been their purpose. From each cable, at regular intervals along its length, hung slender rods of iron, suspenders they were called, dropping down toward the level at which the roadway would eventually sit, waiting to take up the load that had not yet been given to them. It was not enough, however, simply to hang a roadway from vertical rods and trust that the structure would hold steady against every force it might encounter. Roebling, meaning still, in this final phase of the work, the elder engineer's design, carried forward now under his son's supervision and his daughter-in-law's careful stewardship, had long understood that a suspension bridge, for all its grace, carried within its very form a vulnerability that no amount of cable strength could fully answer. A roadway hung only from vertical suspenders was a roadway that could sway and ripple under the passage of wind, could develop in its length a kind of rolling motion that no traveler would wish to cross, and no engineer could responsibly permit. The elder Roebling had studied this problem for decades, had watched other suspension bridges elsewhere in the world twist and fail under wind loads their designers had not adequately considered, and he had resolved, from the earliest sketches of the Brooklyn Bridge, that this structure would not share their fate. His answer was a web of diagonal stays, run in straight lines from high on each tower down to points along the roadway's length, crossing the vertical suspenders at intervals, and creating, when viewed from the side, a pattern that resembled nothing so much as the strings of some vast and geometric harp. These diagonal stays served a purpose distinct from the suspenders. Where the vertical rods carried the roadway's weight down into the main cables, the diagonals added stiffness to the entire system, resisting the tendency of the deck to move independently of the towers, binding the whole structure together into something closer to a single rigid form than a simple hanging span. It was an elegant solution to a problem that had defeated other engineers, and though it added to the bridge's cost and to the complexity of its construction, Roebling had judged it essential, and time would prove him right. The stays, combined with the deep steel trusses that would run the length of the roadway on either side, gave the finished bridge a rigidity against wind that few suspension structures of its era could claim. And it was this rigidity, as much as any single cable or tower, that allowed the Brooklyn Bridge to stand through storms that toppled lesser and later spans. The trusses themselves were raised section by section along the length of the bridge, great lattices of iron beams bolted together into deep, stiff frameworks that ran beneath and beside the roadway's eventual surface, adding their own strength to the structure's resistance against bending and swaying. Cranes, mounted on the completed portions of the work, lifted each new section into place, where ironworkers, many of them the same men who had spun the cables or built the towers, their skills now turned to this newer task, fitted and bolted the pieces together, working outward from the towers toward the center of each span. Meeting eventually somewhere near the midpoint of the river, in a final joining, not unlike the closing of the cables themselves, though quieter, less celebrated, but no less essential to the bridge's completion. Above the trusses, the deck itself began to take shape. A wooden roadway at first, laid across the iron framework, planked and fitted to carry the loads that would soon pass over it. But the design called for more than a single undivided surface. And here, again, the foresight of the bridge's planning revealed itself in ways that would only become fully apparent in the decades ahead. The roadway was divided into separate lanes, each intended for a different kind of traffic, arranged in a configuration that no other bridge of its time had attempted at such scale. On the outer edges ran lanes for horse-drawn vehicles, wagons and carriages, of every description that would carry the ordinary commerce of two cities back and forth across the river. Between these outer lanes, occupying the center of the structure, ran tracks intended for an elevated railway, a system of cable-drawn trains that would carry passengers across the bridge far more quickly than any horse could manage, moving thousands of people each day between Manhattan and Brooklyn in a service that would become, within a short time of the bridge's opening, one of its most heavily used features. And above all of this, raised higher than the vehicle lanes and the rail tracks alike, ran a promenade reserved for those on foot, a walkway suspended above the working roadway, offering to pedestrians a view of the river and the two cities that no passenger in a carriage or a railway car could fully share. A quiet civic gift folded into the bridge's design, almost as an afterthought, though it would become in time one of the structure's most beloved features. There was something remarkable, looking back across the years of the bridge's planning and construction, in how thoroughly its design had anticipated forms of use that scarcely existed or did not exist at all when the first drawings were made. The elevated railway had been conceived at a time when such systems were still a novelty in American cities, their long-term success far from assured. The roadway's width and structure, built to carry horse-drawn traffic in an age when few could have imagined any alternative, would prove decades later to be entirely capable of carrying the automobile. A machine that did not yet exist, that no engineer in the 1860s or 70s could have specifically foreseen, but which the bridge's generous proportions and its deep, rigid trusses would accommodate without any fundamental alteration to the original structure. It was as though the elder Roebling, in the years of solitary study that had preceded even the first stone of the towers, had built into his design a kind of margin for a future he could not clearly see, trusting that whatever changes might come to the traffic of a growing city, a sufficiently strong and sufficiently rigid structure would be equal to it. This was perhaps the quietest form of genius the bridge possessed, not the visible daring of the towers or the cables, but the patient, almost humble foresight of a design built to outlast its own moment. As the roadway neared its completion, the final months of the work took on a different quality than anything that had come before. There was less of the raw physical danger that had marked the caisson work or the cable spinning, and more of a careful, methodical checking and rechecking of every element of the finished structure, inspections of the cables and their wrapping, tests of the suspenders and stays, examinations of the trusses and the decking, each carried out with the understanding that this bridge, more than a decade in the making, would soon be asked to bear the weight and trust of two entire cities. In both Brooklyn and Manhattan, a mounting anticipation had begun to build, visible in the newspapers that tracked the bridge's progress with an attention that had, over the years of construction, grown from skepticism into something closer to civic pride. The structure that had once been doubted, mocked, and feared by so many was now watched with a kind of impatience. A public eager to see completed what had for so long existed only as towers and cables and promise, a span that had already become, before its opening, a landmark against the sky of both cities. Visible from streets and rooftops and ferries long before a single wagon had crossed its length, but the years that had built the bridge had not passed without cost, and nowhere was this more plainly felt than within the Roebling family itself, whose name had been bound to the project since its earliest conception. The elder engineer, John Roebling, had given his life to the bridge before its foundations were even begun, his injury and subsequent death coming in the earliest days of the survey work, years before the towers rose or the cables were spun. Felt again and again by those who carried his design forward in his absence. His son, who had taken up the work in his father's place, had given to the bridge not his life outright, but something almost as costly. His health, broken in the caissons beneath the river, leaving him for years unable to appear at the site he had directed, watching the work rise through a telescope from a sickroom window. Dependent entirely on the reports and observations brought to him each day by his wife. That the bridge now neared completion at all was owed to this quiet partnership of father and son, of illness endured and work continued, of a family that had paid in health and in life for a structure that would soon belong, in full, to the two cities it was built to join. By the spring of 1883, the towers had long stood finished, the cables had long been spun and wrapped, and the roadway itself had been laid, plank by plank and rail by rail, across the length of the span. What remained was not labor but ceremony, not construction but consecration, the formal turning over of a structure that had already, in every practical sense, proven itself capable of standing. The date chosen was the 24th of May, a Thursday, and as it approached, both cities began to prepare themselves for something that few of their citizens had ever witnessed and that none of them would forget. Brooklyn, still legally its own city, independent of Manhattan, and proud of that independence, treated the day as something close to a civic holiday. Manhattan, for its part, approached the occasion with the mixture of curiosity and proprietary pride that a great metropolis reserves for anything built to serve it. Newspapers on both shores had spent weeks describing what the day would hold, printing diagrams of the bridge's structure, biographies of its engineers, and predictions of the crowds expected to gather. When the morning of the 24th arrived, those predictions proved, if anything, modest. By the accounts that survive, the crowds began gathering along both waterfronts hours before the ceremonies were scheduled to begin. Rooftops near the bridge's approaches filled with spectators. Windows overlooking the river were rented out for the occasion, some at prices that struck contemporary observers as extravagant. Ferries crossing the East River that morning carried passengers who had come for no other purpose than to watch the day unfold from the water, to see the bridge from below as it prepared to receive its first official crossing from above. Estimates of the total number of people who gathered that day, whether along the shores, on the bridge itself, or on the water, in small boats and larger vessels chartered for the occasion, vary considerably in the sources, some placing the figure in the hundreds of thousands. What is consistent across the accounts is the sense that this was among the largest public gatherings either city had ever seen. A convergence of ordinary citizens, drawn by the plain desire to witness something they had been told for over a decade could not be done. The ceremonies themselves began at the Brooklyn approach in the early afternoon, with a procession of dignitaries that included the mayors of both cities, prominent members of the bridge's board of trustees, engineers who had served on the project in various capacities over the years, and a delegation of state and federal officials. Among these officials was President Chester Arthur, who had traveled from Washington to attend, accompanied by New York's governor. Arthur's presence lent the occasion a formality that elevated it beyond a local celebration into something closer to a national event, a recognition, at the highest levels of government, that what had been built across the East River was not merely a convenience for two adjacent cities, to the country as a whole. Arthur crossed the bridge that afternoon as part of the official procession, walking with the other dignitaries from the Manhattan side toward Brooklyn, where he was received with the kind of civic ceremony that a triumphant homecoming might warrant, though he was, of course, a visitor rather than a native son. Speeches followed, delivered by trustees and officials, praising the engineers, the workers, and the vision that had sustained the project through its long and difficult years. The speeches, by most accounts, were lengthy, formal, and typical of the oratory of the age, filled with references to progress, to the triumph of human will over natural obstacle, and to the bridge as a symbol of what the two cities might yet become when joined. As evening fell, the celebration shifted from oratory to spectacle. Fireworks were set off from the bridge itself and from barges positioned on the river below, illuminating the towers and the cables in bursts of colored light that reflected off the water and drew still more spectators to the shorelines. Accounts describe the display as among the most elaborate the city had yet staged, a fitting close to a day that had already exceeded, in scale and enthusiasm, what many had expected. Brooklyn, in particular, treated the fireworks as a kind of civic exclamation point, a public declaration that the city on the eastern shore of the river was no longer to be regarded as a mere suburb of its larger neighbor, but as a full partner in a structure that had cost, by that point, an amount of money and human effort difficult for most observers to fully comprehend. Amid the speeches and the fireworks, one figure moved through the day's events with a significance that the assembled crowds may not have fully grasped, though history has since recorded it carefully. Emily Roebling, who had served for over a decade as the intermediary between her husband and the work he could no longer personally oversee, was given the honor, according to the accounts that survive, of being the first to cross the completed bridge in an official capacity, riding in a carriage that made the crossing before the formal ceremonies began. She is said to have carried with her a live rooster, a symbol in the customs of the Age of Victory, and its presence in her carriage that day has been remembered in the retellings that followed. It's a quiet but pointed gesture, a declaration that the bridge had been won, that the years of illness and delay and doubt had ended in triumph. Whether the detail of the rooster reflects a single, well-documented moment or has taken on some embellishment through repeated telling, the sources do not entirely agree, but the broader fact of her ceremonial crossing and the symbolic weight assigned to it by those who recorded the day is not in dispute. She had earned that crossing as thoroughly as any of the engineers or officials who processed behind her, having carried the technical burden of the project through years when her husband could not. Washington Roebling himself did not walk across the bridge that day, nor did he appear at any of the ceremonies held in his honor. His health, broken years earlier in the caissons beneath the river, had never sufficiently recovered to allow him the physical exertion that public appearance would have required. And so he remained, as he had for so much of the bridge's later construction, at his residence, watching the celebrations from a window with the aid of a telescope. Observing at a distance the fireworks and the crowds and the great arc of lit cables spanning the river he had spent the better part of his adult life trying to cross with steel and stone. Accounts of that evening describe a small gathering held in his honor at his home, attended by some of the officials and engineers who had worked alongside him, a private counterpart to the public ceremony taking place across the river. As though the city understood that the man most responsible for the bridge's completion could not be brought to the celebration, and so brought a portion of the celebration to him instead. It is recorded that he expressed satisfaction with the day's events, quiet and understated, consistent with the character that had carried him through so many years of illness and frustration, watching from a sick room what he could no longer approach in person. The formal opening concluded that night, and the following day the bridge was declared open to the public, free for pedestrians to cross on foot, with tolls established for vehicles and livestock, according to a schedule set by the trustees. In the days that followed, the crowds continued, drawn now not by ceremony but by simple curiosity, ordinary citizens walking the promenade that Roebling had designed specifically for pedestrian use, elevated above the roadway, offering unobstructed views of the harbor and the two cities it joined. It was on that same promenade, however, only a week after the opening celebrations, that the bridge's first great tragedy occurred, remembered soberly by the historical record rather than sensationally, though it left a lasting mark on the memory of those early days. On the 30th of May, amid the dense crowds still drawn to the new structure, a woman is said to have stumbled on the promenade stairway, and in the confusion that followed, a rumor spread rapidly through the crowd that the bridge itself was collapsing or giving way beneath the weight of so many people. The panic that resulted led to a crush of bodies pressing toward the exits, and in the crowded stairways and narrow passages, a number of people lost their lives, crushed or trampled in the stampede that followed from what proved in the end to be an unfounded fear. The bridge had not moved, had not weakened, had not failed in any structural sense. The danger had come entirely from the fear of failure, rather than failure itself. A grim irony that the newspapers of the following days noted with some solemnity, and that later chroniclers have continued to record as a sober coda to an otherwise triumphant opening. The bridge, having survived both the celebration and the tragedy that followed so closely upon it, settled thereafter into the daily rhythm that would define the remainder of its existence. No longer a spectacle to be marveled at from a distance, but a working structure carrying the ordinary traffic of two cities across water that had once required a ferry crossing measured in minutes, rather than the few unhurried moments now needed to walk or ride across the span itself. Its true test, the engineers understood, had not been the ceremonies of its opening, but the years of use that would follow, the accumulated weight of carriages and pedestrians, and in time, streetcars and railway traffic, pressing daily upon the cables and towers that Roebling had designed to endure far beyond what any single day's celebration could demonstrate. In the months that followed the opening, the bridge settled into a rhythm that was less spectacle than habit, the sort of daily use that reveals a structure's true character far more honestly than any ribbon cutting ever could. Pedestrians came first in the greatest numbers, drawn by curiosity as much as necessity, walking the elevated promenade that John Roebling had insisted upon from the earliest drafts of his design. A walkway raised above the roadways so that those on foot might cross in safety and not incidentally, in view of a panorama that no one in either city had ever before been offered from such a height above the water. Merchants and clerks, dock workers and schoolchildren all found their way onto the promenade in numbers that surprised even those who had championed the bridge loudest, and within its first year, the structure carried foot traffic that ran into the millions, a testament less to any single day's wonder than to the simple fact that the bridge had become useful, which is the quieter and more lasting form of triumph. Below the promenade, on the outer roadways, horse-drawn carriages and wagons took up the crossing in their turn, delivering goods and passengers between Manhattan and Brooklyn at a pace that the old ferries, dependent on tide and weather, and the patience of harbor traffic. Between these outer lanes ran the innermost tracks given over to a cable-powered railway that had been part of the bridge's purpose from early in its planning, a system of railway cars drawn by an endless traveling cable anchored to steam-driven machinery on the Brooklyn side. This elevated railway, opened not long after the bridge itself, became in time the busiest component of the entire crossing, carrying passengers back and forth in a matter of minutes at a volume that would eventually reach into the tens of millions of riders each year, a figure that even the bridge's most confident champions had not fully anticipated when the towers were still rising out of the river. It was in this atmosphere of growing, but still somewhat untested public confidence that one of the more curious episodes in the bridge's early history took place, an episode that has survived in the popular memory of the crossing with a vividness that outlasts many of the engineering details themselves. In the spring of 1884, less than a year after the bridge's opening, the showman Phineas Taylor Barnum arranged to lead a procession of 21 elephants, along with a number of camels, across the span in a public display that served both his own commercial interests and, whether by design or fortunate coincidence, the interests of a city and a bridge company still eager to demonstrate the soundness of the structure to a public that had not entirely forgotten the panic and tragedy that had marred the bridge's earliest days of operation. The elephants drawn from Barnum's traveling exhibition were walked across the span in a long and orderly line, their great weight distributed across the roadway in a manner that onlookers on both shores watched with a mixture of amusement and genuine attentiveness. For whatever the showman's motives, the event carried real weight, quite literally, as a public test of the bridge's capacity to bear loads far different from the carriages and pedestrians for which it had been most immediately designed. The crossing passed without incident, the elephants proceeding at their own unhurried pace from one shore to the other, and the newspapers of the following days recorded the event with the sort of good humor that suggested the city had taken the spectacle as confirmation of something it already suspected, namely that the bridge Roebling and his engineers had built was equal to almost any demand that might reasonably or unreasonably be placed upon it. Historians examining the surviving accounts have noted that the event, while genuine and well documented in the press of the day, likely served Barnum's own promotional interests as much as it served any lingering public anxiety about the bridge's strength. And the two purposes were, in the manner of much 19th century civic spectacle, not easily separated from one another. Whatever the balance of motives, the crossing of the elephants has endured in memory as a vivid and almost gentle demonstration of confidence, a moment in which the sheer improbability of the sight, animals more commonly associated with jungle and circus tent, walking calmly above a river on a structure of stone and wire, captured something of the wonder that the bridge itself had always been meant to inspire. As the years passed and the city on either shore continued its restless growth, the bridge itself began to change in ways that Roebling, working from his sickroom decades earlier, could not have precisely foreseen, though the flexibility of his design allowed for exactly this kind of gradual adaptation. The cable railway that had carried so many passengers in the bridge's early decades eventually gave way to newer forms of transit as the 20th century advanced, and the underground subway systems of New York expanded to serve a population that had grown far beyond what any single elevated railway could accommodate. The tracks were removed in stages, the machinery that had once drawn the cable cars back and forth was retired, and the space they had occupied was given over, in time, to the growing demands of automobile traffic, a form of transportation that had not existed at all when the bridge's first stones were laid, and that would nonetheless come. Within a few decades of the bridge's opening, to dominate the roadways of both cities in a manner that required the bridge to be reconsidered and, where necessary, reconfigured. The widening of the roadways for automobile use was neither swift nor without controversy, for it required careful study of loads and clearances that the bridge's original designers had calculated for very different kinds of traffic. And engineers examining the structure decades after its completion found themselves in the peculiar position of testing 19th century steel and stone against the demands of a transportation age. Its builders had never anticipated. The trolley lines that had briefly supplemented the cable railway were likewise removed as the century progressed, and the roadway was reorganized more than once to accommodate the growing number of private automobiles crossing between the boroughs, until the bridge that had once carried carriages, pedestrians, and cable cars in careful separation came to carry primarily the steady flow of motor vehicles that has defined its use for most of the 20th century and into the present day. Through each of these modifications, the essential structure that Roebling had designed, the towers, the cables, the great diagonal stays that gave the bridge so much of its characteristic web-like appearance when viewed from below, remained substantially unchanged. A testament to a design generous enough in its original tolerances to accommodate uses its creator could not have specifically predicted but had, in some more general sense, built room for. The bridge's endurance through the physical trials of weather and time offers its own quiet chronicle of the soundness of its original construction. Storms that battered the harbor and its two cities across the decades found the span still standing when they had passed, its cables holding steady against winds that had, in the memory of the city's oldest residents, brought down lesser structures along the waterfront. Ice that formed on the river in hard winters, and that had once been blamed for damage to a support cable during the bridge's earliest and most anxious days of operation, was met in later years with modifications and vigilance that prevented any repetition of that early alarm. The bridge carried loads across the ensuing decades that grew steadily heavier as automobiles multiplied, and the volume of daily crossings climbed into figures that would have seemed fantastical to the engineers of the 1880s, and yet the structure held, performing across a stretch of decades what amounted to a continuous unspoken test, far more demanding and far more informative than any single day's celebration or exhibition could have been. It was during moments of particular civic strain that the bridge's steady presence became something more than mere infrastructure, taking on in the memory of the city a quality closer to reassurance. During periods when the city's transit systems were disrupted by strikes among transportation workers, the bridge became one of the few reliable routes by which residents of Brooklyn and Manhattan could still reach one another, its pedestrian promenade filling once more as it had in its earliest days with walkers making a crossing. For entirely different reasons, once again a matter of necessity rather than leisure. Through the years of the First World War and later the Second, as the city around it mobilized, in ways both visible and unseen, the bridge continued its unbroken service, carrying workers to factories and docks, carrying goods across the river without pause, standing as one fixed point of continuity, while so much else in the life of the two cities it joined was given over to the uncertainties and disruptions of wartime. It asked for no particular notice during these years, offered no ceremony to mark its continued function, and yet its steadiness through decades that included economic collapse, mechanized warfare, and the complete transformation of urban transportation, gathered one ordinary crossing at a time, that the men who had built it, and the one woman who had seen it through to completion, had built something that did not merely open to great fanfare, but endured, patiently and almost silently, long after the fanfare had faded from memory. In time, the bridge became not only a crossing, but a subject of study, and the men who came after John Roebling and Washington Roebling and Emily Roebling turned their attention to it with the particular reverence that engineers reserve for work they know they could not easily improve upon. They surveyed its cables, measured the sag of its span under load, examined the granite of its towers for the fine cracks that decades of frost and thaw might have opened, and in doing so they built a second history of the bridge, quieter than the first, made not of hammers and derricks, but of instruments and reports. Careful hands tracing the same lines that other careful hands had drawn half a century before. This was the bridge's second life, less visible than its first, but no less essential, and it began almost as soon as the structure had settled into its long routine of carrying the city across the river, for a work of this scale, once built, is never truly finished. It asks, forever afterward, to be watched. The steel wire that Roebling had insisted upon, the wire tested strand by strand, despite the fraud that had tried to corrupt it, proved sound across the years, in the way that patient verification always proves more valuable than haste. But wire, however sound, exists in a world of weather, and the cables of the bridge, exposed to rain and salt air and the slow chemistry of oxidation, required attention that the original builders had anticipated, even if they could not have described its exact fall. Inspectors climbed into the cables themselves in the decades that followed, opening small sections of the wrapping to examine the strands beneath, checking for the rust that might, if left unaddressed, quietly undo what tension and geometry had so carefully achieved. What they found, again and again, was a structure aging as it had been built, deliberately and well, though not without the ordinary wear that time visits upon all things made by human hands. Some wires had corroded, most had not. The margin of safety that Roebling had built into his calculations, the same margin that had allowed him to say, with confidence born of mathematics rather than bravado, that the bridge would stand even if some fraction of its material proved weaker than promised, revealed itself now as more than a boast. It was a debt paid forward to a future the engineer would never see, a gift from a man confined to his sick room to inspectors who would not be born for generations, and they received it when they understood what they were looking at with something close to gratitude. The roadway too asked for renewal as the 20th century advanced, and the vehicles crossing it grew heavier and more numerous than horse-drawn carriages and early trolleys had ever been. The bridge that had been designed in an age of hoofs and rail found itself carrying automobiles by the thousands, and then, by the tens of thousands, a burden its builders could not have precisely foreseen, but had again, through the caution built into every calculation, largely anticipated in the strength of their design. Engineers studied the deck, reinforced sections where use had worn them thin, adjusted the flow of traffic across its lanes as the city's needs shifted, and in every alteration they worked with a certain deference toward the original structure, changing only what needed changing, preserving what had already proven itself. Treating the bridge less as an obstacle to modern convenience than as an inheritance to be maintained rather than remade. This deference was not universal in the history of American infrastructure, where older structures were often demolished to make way for newer, wider, faster solutions. But the bridge across the East River had, by the middle of the 20th century, already acquired a status that placed it beyond such casual replacement. It had become, in the eyes of engineers and ordinary citizens alike, a monument as much as a machine, and monuments are treated differently than mere infrastructure, however much their function may remain the same. The towers themselves, those twin structures of granite and limestone, that had risen so laboriously from their underwater foundations required their own forms of care as the decades accumulated. Masonry ages differently than steel, more slowly in some respects, more unpredictably in others, and the pointed arches that Roebling had designed with such attention to both strength and appearance were examined periodically for the fine deterioration that stone undergoes when exposed for a century or more to the freezing and thawing of a northern climate. Restoration work on the towers, when it came, was undertaken with craftsmen who understood that they were not simply repairing a building, but continuing a conversation with builders long dead, matching stone to stone, mortar to mortar, seeking always to preserve the exact character of the original work, rather than to impose upon it the conventions of their own era. This is a particular discipline distinct from ordinary construction, one that asked the worker to suppress his own preferences in service of a vision established by someone else, in service of an integrity that exists not in any single stone, but in the whole assembled structure and the fact that such work was undertaken at all, across generations, speaks to how thoroughly the bridge had embedded itself in the identity of the city it served. Beyond the physical maintenance, the bridge became, over time, a subject of formal historical and engineering study, examined by scholars who sought to understand not merely how it had been built, but why it had succeeded where so many contemporaries had predicted failure. Papers were written analyzing the caisson work, the wire fraud and its detection, the mathematics of the cable curves, the extraordinary circumstance of an engineer directing construction from his sick room through the mediation of his wife. These studies, appearing across decades in engineering journals and later in popular histories, gradually assembled a fuller picture of the achievement than even its own era had possessed. For those who lived through the construction had been too close to it, too caught up in the daily drama of doubt and progress, to see clearly what the whole would eventually mean. It fell to later generations, working from surviving records, from Washington Roebling's own extensive notes, from newspaper accounts and construction logs, to reconstruct the full scope of what had been accomplished, and to place it within the longer history of engineering achievement, a history the bridge itself had significantly altered. For the bridge across the East River did not simply stand as an isolated triumph. It became a hinge point in the broader history of great spans, the structure against which subsequent achievements were measured and from which subsequent engineers drew both technical lessons and a kind of permission to attempt what had previously seemed beyond reach. The suspension principle that Roebling had refined, the use of steel wire in place of iron, the diagonal stays that added stiffness against the wind, the caisson method for reaching bedrock beneath a river too deep and too swift for ordinary foundation work, these techniques and innovations passed into the general vocabulary of engineering, studied and adapted by those who would go on to span other rivers, other straits, other gaps that ambition demanded be closed. The bridges that followed, some of them longer, some of them taller, some of them employing materials and methods Roebling could not have imagined, nonetheless carried within them a debt to the East River crossing. A debt acknowledged explicitly in engineering literature and implicitly in the confidence with which later builders approached challenges that might otherwise have seemed insurmountable. If a bridge could be built across a river as difficult as the East River, with technology as unproven as steel wire cable and pneumatic caissons sunk to unprecedented depths, then perhaps other seemingly impossible crossings might also yield to sufficient calculation. The bridge had proven, publicly and permanently, that the impossible was often simply the untried. This influence extended beyond the purely technical, for the bridge across the East River had also demonstrated something about the relationship between grand infrastructure and civic identity, about the way a single structure could become inseparable from the character of the place it served. Cities that followed sought their own defining structures, their own monuments to ambition and capability. And while not all succeeded in producing anything as enduring or as beloved, the aspiration itself owed something to the example set beside the river between Manhattan and Brooklyn. The bridge had shown that infrastructure need not be merely functional, that a crossing built to solve a practical problem of transportation could also become a work of considerable beauty, its towers rising with an almost cathedral-like majesty, its web of cables catching light in ways that transformed engineering into something closer to art. This lesson, too, passed forward into the design philosophy of subsequent generations of bridge builders, who increasingly understood that the structures they raised would be seen, would be photographed, would become part of the visual identity of the places they served, and that this visibility carried its own form of responsibility. Distinct from but related to the responsibility of structural soundness. And so the bridge continued its long dialogue with time, studied by engineers who sought to understand it, restored by craftsmen who sought to preserve it, and cited by builders who sought to surpass it, though few would ever fully succeed in matching the particular combination of circumstance and character that had produced it. It remained, through all of this attention, remarkably itself, the same essential structure that had opened on that clear morning in 1883, its towers still rising in the same proportions, its cables still following the same mathematically determined curves. Its roadway still carrying traffic across the same stretch of water that had once seemed to defy any permanent crossing. The world around it had transformed beyond recognition. The skyline it once dominated, now surrounded by structures taller than its towers could have imagined. The transportation it once served, now sharing space with vehicles unimaginable to its builders, and yet the bridge itself persisted. A fixed point of granite and steel around which an entire city's history had continued to unfold, patient, watchful, and quietly certain of its own continuing purpose.